The Manhattan skyline glittered like a million tiny ambitions pressed against glass. But Christian Ackerman barely noticed. He sat in his corner office, 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows. The kind of view people fought their whole careers to earn, and yet his eyes were fixed on the faint reflection of a man who looked far more tired than 32 should ever allow. The phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. He recognized the number, and something cold pressed lightly against the back of his neck. His grandfather's attorney never called without reason. Christian answered, expecting paperwork. Formalities, something mundane. What he heard instead cracked something dormant inside him. Chris, there's another will. A second letter. Actually, a pause. It's been sealed for 30 years. Christian felt his pulse stumble. His grandfather wasn't merely a man, he was the anchor. The quiet force who had raised him after his father died, and his mother drowned herself in work. The idea that this man had kept a secret large enough to require a 30-year seal felt surreal. What kind of letter Chris forced out, keeping his voice steady. There was the rustling sound of paper on the other end. Then the cautious tone lawyers, reserved for clients, standing on the edge of something life-changing. It contains the deed to the lake house in Christmas Cove. And a photograph. A photograph of your grandfather holding the hand of a little black girl. The picture is dated December 24th, 1992. A strange heat flooded Chris's face. A child. Yes. The lawyer continued. On the back of the photograph, he wrote, "If one day my son finds this girl, care for her as family." A beat of silence. Chris, the lawyer added softly, "Did your grandfather ever mention her?" "No." His voice cracked. "Never." Some people describe shock as numbness. But Christian didn't feel numb. He felt everything too much like his senses had been stripped raw. The office seemed suddenly too bright, too still. The city outside too loud. He pushed a hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining it without caring at all. The lawyer went on. He left instructions. You were not to open this envelope until this very December, and you must host Christmas at the lake house exactly as he once did. Why? That, Chris, you'll only understand when you go. By the time the call ended, Christian's whole world had shifted a few degrees, just enough for everything familiar to feel foreign, for every memory of his grandfather to feel incomplete. He lifted the envelope lying on the desk, thick, heavy with meaning. He slipped out the photo again, staring at it as if the paper might breathe. The child was no older than 7. She had deep brown skin, a small, proud chin, raised as if the photographer had been someone she trusted, and her eyes glowed with a determination that didn't match her age. They were curious, bright, familiar. Too familiar. It wasn't that she looked exactly like him. She didn't. But something in the gaze, a hint of the same fire, the same defiance he'd always had, even as a boy, made his stomach twist. Why had his grandfather entrusted her to him? Why hide her existence? Why? After a lifetime of shared breakfasts, fishing trips, quiet evenings on the porch, had he never spoken her name aloud? The photo trembled slightly between his fingers. Christian stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. He didn't stop to tell his assistant he was leaving. He simply walked out of the office like the walls had begun to close in. The elevator doors reflected a man who looked shredded inside a man who, for the first time in a decade, wasn't thinking about meetings or projections or quarterly reports. He was thinking about betrayal, about love, about legacy, and about the fragile, unknown thread tying him to a girl who might not even be alive anymore. Hours later, his car cut through the icy silence of Maine's winter. Snow exploded softly beneath the tires, the world narrowing to a two-lane road lined with sleeping pines. The farther he drove, the more memories surfaced. Christmas lights strung around the porch railing, hot cocoa steaming in mismatched mugs, his grandfather's low laugh echoing across the lake. Those had been the happiest winters of his life. Real, uncomplicated joy. Before work consumed him, before his grandfather grew sick, before Chris became a man who measured success in revenue rather than in moments. He crossed the familiar bridge to Rutherford Island. The wooden boards thumped beneath his wheels. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat growing louder, faster. Halfway across, he pulled over. The cold outside seeped instantly into the warmth of the car when he opened the door. The wind tasted metallic, sharp, carrying the smell of snow. He took the photograph out again, holding it up toward the pale winter light. The girl stared back at him, as if challenging him to remember something he had never known. "What are you to me?" he whispered. The wind gave no answer, but his memory did. A tiny flicker, his grandfather, years ago, telling him that family wasn't always blood, that sometimes fate tied people together in ways too complicated to explain. Christian hadn't understood then. He wondered if he understood now. A thought crept in, uninvited and impossible to ignore. Did grandfather have another child? A secret daughter? Someone who never belonged to the world of lake houses and holiday dinners? And if so, was this girl her child? Was she? My cousin. The idea twisted something painful in his chest. If the girl was family, blood family, the responsibility in his grandfather's letter wasn't sentimental. It was literal. And if she wasn't family, then what connection had bound an elderly white man in coastal Maine to a young black child 30 years ago? Why had he sworn Chris to find her? Why had he waited until after his death to reveal her? The bridge groaned under a gust of wind. Chris closed the door and sat back behind the wheel, breath clouding the air. He wasn't afraid of much, not boardrooms, not billion-dollar pressure, not confrontation. But this made him feel like a boy again, lost, vulnerable. 3 inches tall in a world too wide. At the end of the bridge, he saw the sign, Christmas Cove. Welcome home, home. The word felt both warm and cruel. He started the engine. As he drove toward the lake house, a strange certainty grew inside him, a magnetic tug he couldn't explain. The girl in the photograph wasn't just a mystery from his grandfather's past. She was tied to his future, to the unraveling of something long buried, to the rewriting of the man he thought he was. He didn't know yet that she walked this town, that she laughed here, worked here, breathed this same winter air, that fate had been quietly stitching their stories together for years, waiting for this moment. He didn't know he was driving toward a woman who would change everything, a woman with warm brown skin, bright, determined eyes, and a smile that could melt every lie the past had ever told. He didn't know he was minutes away from meeting Meredith. But destiny did, and it was waiting for him in the snow. South Bristol woke slowly that morning, snow drifting lazily past rooftops, as if the town itself had decided to breathe softer for the holiday season. Meredith Block stood by her living room window, coffee mug cupped between chilled fingers, watching tiny flakes dissolve against the glass. Her house small, creaky, old enough to complain every time the heater kicked on, glowed with strings of colored lights she'd hung the night before. She did it every December without fail, even though the act felt strangely hollow. Lights, garlands, wreaths, everything she'd longed for as a child, and yet none of it filled the quiet ache inside her. When she was little, she used to drag boxes of ornaments into the living room all by herself, humming Christmas songs no one taught her, while her parents worked double shifts at the hospital and in the lab. They weren't unkind, just exhausted, brilliant, consumed by careers that demanded relentless devotion. Holidays were an inconvenience in their world, a disruption in schedules too precious to break. So Meredith grew up celebrating with fairy lights and imaginary conversations, learning early how to create magic for herself, because no one else would. Those memories should have faded with time, but they lived in her still, shaping her into a woman who believed in beauty yet braced herself for disappointment. Perhaps that was why she'd poured everything she had into her small event planning company, hoping to build for others what she never truly had: warmth, celebration, connection. And perhaps that was why it hurt so deeply when the business nearly collapsed the year before, after a wealthy client accused her of stealing a designer watch during a private holiday party. The accusation was false, thrown at her without hesitation, the way people sometimes tossed blame at black women when they needed an easy villain. Though the charges were dropped and the watch eventually found misplaced by the man's own teenage son, Meredith's reputation took the blow. It had taken months to recover. Months of scraping through tiny jobs, building trust one careful step at a time, always with the quiet fear that one whisper could undo her again. So when her phone rang that morning and an unfamiliar Manhattan area code flashed across the screen, her breath stilled. She nearly let it ring out, nearly. But curiosity nudged her thumb to swipe. The voice on the other end belonged to a young woman, polished, efficient, introducing herself as Beth Reynolds, assistant to a Mr. Christian Ackerman, whose name meant nothing to Meredith until Beth mentioned the advance payment, a sum large enough to cover a quarter's expenses, delivered for a single holiday event. 3 months of steady breathing for a company still learning to stand again. Meredith pressed her fingertips to her temple, torn between instinct and need. She'd promised herself never to work for the ultra-wealthy again, not after last year. Not after swallowing the humiliation of being treated like someone whose integrity could be priced and discarded. But then Beth mentioned one phrase that snagged her heart in a way she didn't expect: a Christmas gathering, planned according to the wishes of someone who passed away. Something softened inside her. Love, loss, legacy, Christmas. Those were the ingredients she understood better than anyone. She agreed to the meeting before her brain caught up. By 9:30, she was at the cafe picking up hot coffee and donuts because an early winter morning deserved comfort, and because her gut told her the house she was headed to would likely be empty, cold from disuse. Her breath formed small clouds as she walked up the long driveway toward the lake house, boots crunching over untouched snow. The house itself stood quietly among fir trees, beautiful in the way old homes often were, a little weathered, a little lonely, a little in need of someone to coax it back to life. Meredith felt an immediate kinship with it. She lifted her hand to knock. The door swung open before she touched it. She froze. The man standing before her was unfairly striking in that polished, metropolitan way New York men often carried, without trying tall. Sharp-jawed, wrapped in a dark wool sweater that made his eyes glow unnaturally blue. But what caught her breath wasn't his looks. It was the way he looked at her. He didn't blink, didn't speak, just stared, as though someone had reached through time and slapped him with a memory he didn't know he had. There was shock there, raw, unfiltered, but something else too. Something like recognition. Meredith felt a strange flicker of nerves rise beneath her ribs. She had met many clients in her life. Timid, arrogant, wealthy, clueless, kind, indifferent, but never one who looked at her like this. Like she'd stepped out of a dream and into his doorway unannounced. She cleared her throat gently. Good morning. I'm Meredith Block. From Merry Events. We had a 10 o'clock. He interrupted without realizing it. You look... He stopped, visibly reining himself in. Hi. Sorry. Yes. I'm Chris. His voice was low, controlled, but Meredith sensed something frayed in it. She held out the coffee carrier. I brought these, just in case you didn't have groceries yet. Something in his face softened, as though the gesture hit deeper than she intended. He accepted the cups slowly, like he wasn't sure they were real. Thank you. As he stepped back to let her in, she felt an odd pull just for a second, a whisper of intuition tracing the edges of her spine. Something about this man, this house, this morning, felt like it belonged to a story already in motion. She followed him inside, taking in the aged charm of the living room, the faint scent of cedar and cold air, the way the fireplace looked as though it had been waiting decades to be lit. Chris led her through the space with a quietness she couldn't decipher. He wasn't rude or detached, but he wasn't focused either. His mind was clearly somewhere else, yet it kept coming back to her, flickering in his gaze every time he glanced her way. This project is important, he said at last. It was my grandfather's final request. The words held weight. Meredith nodded gently. I'll help you honor him. She meant it, sincerely, more sincerely than she expected. But when she turned toward the window, letting the winter light wash over her, Chris quietly slipped a photograph from his pocket. She didn't see it. She didn't see how his fingers trembled. She didn't see the little girl in the picture, brown skin, bright eyes. Holding his grandfather's hand, staring back at him with the same determined warmth that lived on Meredith's face. What she did feel, without understanding why, was a strange tension tightening the air between them, as if the universe had just revealed its hand to one of them and was waiting for the other to catch up. Meredith had no idea she was the echo of a secret. Chris had no idea whether she was the answer or the danger. But one thing was undeniable as she finally met his gaze again. Whatever connection sparked in that doorway was real. And it was only the beginning of a story neither of them was prepared for. The moment Chris stepped back to let Meredith into the house, the winter air seemed to shift, subtle but unmistakable, like a room inhaling after years of holding its breath. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing out the cold, and for a beat, neither of them spoke. The lake house was quiet, the kind of quiet that held memories in its walls, waiting for someone to touch them again. Chris cleared his throat and gestured for her to follow. He made his decision quickly, Too quickly for someone usually so calculating, but he knew exactly why. He needed her here. Not just as an event planner. Not just because the house demanded warmth, and he didn't know how to bring it back, but because she was a mystery he couldn't walk away from. She looked like the child in the photograph. Not identical, but frighteningly close, in a way that unsettled him more the longer he stared. Her eyes, especially. Determined. Soft when she wasn't guarding them. And more than anything, familiar. A familiarity he shouldn't have felt. So, he offered the job without hesitation, masking his urgency behind the excuse of her thoughtfulness, her professionalism, her insight. Meredith accepted with a composed nod. Though something in her posture hinted she sensed the oddness of his quick decision. She wasn't naive, far from it. She had learned to read people the way some read maps, understanding the detours they tried to hide. But she didn't press him. She simply stood there, absorbing the house with the quiet reverence of someone who knew how to transform spaces, someone who recognized both beauty and hurt with a single glance. They began the tour. Chris led her through the living room first, its vaulted ceilings and frosted windows overlooking the lake. The room felt emptier than it had any right to be, as if grief still clung to the corners like dust. Meredith skimmed her fingers along the mantel, noticing the faint discoloration where old picture frames once stood. "This is where the big tree used to go," Chris said, his voice softer now, almost distant. His gaze flicked toward the center of the room, as if he could still see it, the towering fir, the ornaments his grandfather carved by hand, the way the lights reflected off wrapping paper and laughter. "I'll bring that back," Meredith replied gently. "If you want it the way he used to do it, I can do that. Or something new, if that feels better." He shook his head. "No. The same is good. Just without him." The ache woven into those words pressed against Meredith unexpectedly. She glanced at him, seeing the exhaustion beneath the sharp angles of his face, the heaviness he tried to hide behind composure. She recognized the shape of that grief. She'd carried something like it for years, though hers had been the grief of absence long before she ever understood loss. "Then I'll make it feel like he's here," she said, offering a small smile, the kind of Christmas he'd be proud of. The sincerity in her voice made something inside Chris loosen. It scared him how quickly her presence was beginning to feel grounding. They moved on the old staircase that groaned pleasantly underfoot, the narrow hallway lined with faded wallpaper, the worn carpet that had weathered decades of foot traffic and spilled cocoa and childhood races. Meredith absorbed it all with the eye of someone who cared more about memories than money. When they reached the game room, Chris paused, his hand brushing the back of the old hearts table. This was his favorite room. He murmured, "Mine too. He taught me how to win here, and how to lose." Meredith watched him carefully. He wasn't a man who talked about himself easily. She could hear the restraint in every word. But here, surrounded by remnants of the boy he once was, he softened. She could feel it like ice beginning to thaw under the gentlest touch. So this room should feel cozy, she concluded. Warm colors, soft lights. Nothing too polished. A space where people relax without thinking about it. Just like he made it. She smiled. Exactly. And for the first time, he smiled back brief, almost reluctant, but real. As they continued the tour, Meredith grew aware of Chris's eyes on her, not in a way that felt inappropriate or possessive, but curious, searching, like he was trying to place her in a memory he didn't fully trust. It made her slightly uneasy, though she didn't let it show. She'd worked too hard rebuilding her livelihood to let a wealthy, intense stranger shake her confidence. Still, the way he looked at her lingered in her mind, tugging at the edges of her composure. By the time evening settled in, the house felt different, less abandoned, less cold. Meredith unpacked her cookware in the kitchen, humming under her breath as she prepared a test dinner. The rhythmic chopping, the hiss of butter hitting a hot pan, the scent of orange zest and spices, these were familiar comforts, grounding her in a way nothing else could. Cooking was the one inheritance from her Aunt Minnie, her father's older sister, the one who used to sneak treats to little Meredith during summers her parents spent buried in research. Minnie had passed when Mare was only 10, but her recipes lived on in the battered notebook Meredith kept in her apron pocket, a little piece of the woman who taught her what love tasted like. Chris entered the kitchen drawn by the aroma, his expression softening as he watched her move effortlessly between counter and stove. She had tied her curls back with a silk ribbon, her cheeks flushed from the heat. For a moment, he forgot the photograph entirely. For a moment, he saw only a woman whose presence seemed to warm every square foot she stepped into. Dinner was simple but comforting: orange chicken, warm broccoli, a bright salad. Chris ate quietly, watching her more than his plate, taking in the cadence of her voice, the way she explained each dish with a mixture of pride and modesty. But it was dessert that undid him. Chocolate cream pie, smooth, rich, topped with soft whipped cream. He took one bite, and the world narrowed to a pinpoint. The taste hit him like a memory with teeth. His throat tightened. "This," he started, his voice strangled. Meredith's brow creased in worry. "Too sweet, too heavy. No." He shook his head slowly. "This is my grandfather's pie." She blinked, confused. "I'm sure it's not." "It is," he insisted, breath uneven. The only person who ever made it was him, using a recipe from someone named Minnie. Meredith stilled. "I had an aunt, Minnie," she said softly. "This is her recipe." Chris stared at her, the air between them sharpening, thickening, pulsing with something neither of them could define. She looked back, a flicker of unease, curiosity, and something else, something warmer crossing her face. His heart thudded once, hard, because suddenly the mystery wasn't abstract or distant. It was sitting across from him, breathing, blinking, unaware of the gravity of her own existence in his story. She wasn't just reminiscent of the girl in the photograph. She was tangled in the threads of a secret he didn't understand yet. And yet, the more he looked at her, the more another truth rose quietly inside him, a truth he wasn't ready to admit even to himself. He didn't only want answers, he wanted her. The room felt small suddenly, intimate in a way that made both of them draw a breath at the same time. Somewhere outside, the wind lifted snow from the roof and carried it past the window, swirling like a silent promise from the winter night. The first warmth between them had begun, and neither of them knew how powerful it would become. From that night onward, something unspoken shifted between them. Chris felt it first quiet, intrusive, impossible to ignore. Every morning he told himself he should focus on letting Meredith work, focus on fulfilling his grandfather's wishes, focus on the snow gathering outside and the deadlines he kept pushing aside. But instead he found himself drawn to her, not in the shallow, familiar way he'd been drawn to women before, but in a way that made him feel off balance, as if his life had been carefully arranged and she had arrived to tilt the floor beneath him. At first, he tried to rationalize it. She was talented, kind, thoughtful. But as the hours passed, it became impossible to pretend it was simply admiration. Because the clues kept piling up quiet, innocuous details that should have meant nothing, yet tangled themselves into the corners of his mind. Her aunt's name, Minnie. The chocolate cream pie recipe identical to the one his grandfather treasured. The way Meredith instinctively touched the wooden banister, as if she'd climbed similar stairs in childhood. The way she moved through the house with an almost eerie familiarity, pausing in certain rooms as though invisible memories brushed past her. And the most unsettling part, the warmth he felt in her presence, the instinctive trust, the sense of recognition he couldn't explain. He told himself he needed answers, but the truth was, he needed her. One afternoon, while she reviewed lighting layouts in the great room, he forced himself to speak before he lost his nerve. "Did you ever visit Christmas Cove as a child?" The question slipped out sharper than intended. Meredith looked up from her notes, one brow lifting with a dry, almost amused curve. "My family didn't celebrate holidays," she replied with a soft scoff. "They didn't take vacations, and they definitely didn't take me anywhere festive." Her tone was light, but her eyes weren't. Something brittle shimmered under her words, a lifetime of swallowed disappointment. That brittle note hit him unexpectedly, leaving a tight ache in his chest. She wasn't mocking the question. She was shielding herself from the truth of her own childhood, a truth colder than the winter pressing against the windows. And she had absolutely no idea she'd just brushed past the very mystery that haunted him. He thanked her and let the matter drop. But inside, the storm only grew. Meanwhile, Meredith began noticing something too. Something she tried to chalk up to professional courtesy, though her heart insisted on offering more dangerous explanations. Chris wasn't just polite. He was protective in ways that felt strangely intimate. He insisted she use the indoor staircase instead of the icy exterior steps. He brewed her tea in the mornings, without asking how she liked it, and somehow prepared it exactly right. He reminded her to eat when she forgot. He held ladders steady with both hands, even when she told him she didn't need help. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him watching her with an expression that made her heartbeat stumble something fierce and bewildered, equal parts longing and restraint. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was the holidays, the snow, the temporary closeness of two people working in an isolated house. She had been misinterpreted before, and she would not let her heart misinterpret a wealthy client who would return to Manhattan soon. But Chris wasn't returning to Manhattan, not emotionally, not mentally, not at all. He was sinking deeper into the mystery that was Meredith, and deeper into the fear of losing anything else that mattered. Days passed, snow thickening around the lake house. Meredith worked tirelessly, stringing lights, assembling decorations, making the walls breathe with color again. That afternoon, she decided the roof needed one final line of lights, a decision she knew Chris would argue with. So she didn't tell him. She climbed the balcony railing with practiced ease, balancing her weight as she pulled herself onto the roof. The wind was harsher than expected, slicing through her coat, stinging her cheeks. But she kept going. She always kept going. Even when people doubted her. Even when she doubted herself. She knelt to secure the final line when a sudden gust slammed the attic vent door behind her with a heavy, echoing thud. The click of the latch was unmistakable. Locked, cold, knifed through her at once. She tried to shout for Chris, but the wind swallowed her voice whole. Snow thickened, swirling faster, sticking to her hair, numbing her fingers. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to keep her body warm. But the cold seeped in mercilessly. Minutes crawled. The lightheadedness came first, then the trembling. She pressed her cheek to her shoulder, fighting sleep as the snow coated her coat like a burial shroud. She didn't know how long she held on before she felt herself slipping, eyelids heavy, breath thin. Meanwhile, inside, Chris noticed the silence, the too long silence. He called her name once, twice, then something primal surged through him. He ran to the balcony instinctively, eyes locking on the shape curled on the roof. His heart stopped. Meredith. His voice cracked against the wind as he climbed out, barely feeling the cold as he scrambled toward her. He reached her just as her head tipped forward. The sight of her still, pale with frost, lashes dusted with snow, ripped through him with terror he had never known. He gathered her in his arms, her body limp against his chest. Panic thundered through him. Meredith, stay with me. He choked, scooping her closer as he maneuvered them back toward the balcony. Come on, sweetheart. Don't do this. Don't leave me. He didn't realize he was begging until the words shattered from him. He pressed his face to her hair, breath shaking, desperate warmth bleeding from him to her. I can't lose someone else. I can't. Please. He stumbled into the bedroom with her cradled against him and rushed to wrap blankets around her, rubbing her arms, her hands, willing her back. Don't sleep, he whispered, breaking. Don't leave me. Not you. Somewhere between consciousness and cold, Meredith heard something. His voice, frantic, raw, and 3 words, soft but unmistakable. Don't leave me. Something inside her stirred, trembling not from cold, but from emotion. Her heart fluttered weak but alive, answering something she didn't yet understand. Her lips parted, not fully awake yet, but enough to murmur against the fear in his voice. I'm here. He froze, eyes snapping to hers. Relief crashed through him with such force he gasped, and in that single fragile moment, snowstorm howling outside, warmth blooming inside the world between them, shifted again. Not destiny, not mystery. Something far more dangerous. Something far more real. The beginning of love. When Meredith finally opened her eyes, the world returned in soft fragments, the dim glow of bedside lamps, the hush of snow sliding down window panes, the faint scent of cedar and something warmer, something unmistakably him. Chris sat in a chair beside her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped as if in silent prayer. The moment she stirred, he jolted upright, panic flickering across his face with a rawness she had never seen in any man, let alone a man like him. "You're awake," he breathed. Relief washing over him so visibly, she felt it like a hand pressed to her chest. He wrapped a blanket tighter around her shoulders, fussing in a way too tender, too familiar, too dangerous. She thanked him softly, trying to gather her senses as he hovered near, checking her temperature with the back of his hand, insisting she sip warm tea. The intimacy unsettled her, not because it was unwelcome, God. No, but because it made something in her heart twist painfully. She couldn't allow this, couldn't let herself melt into a closeness she knew the world wasn't kind enough to preserve. She'd lived most of her life watching love exist for other people. She knew what it meant to reach and be met with nothing. And yet, this man, this wealthy, privileged, New York golden boy, looked at her like she was the first person who'd ever scared him. She turned her face away, because if she looked at him too long, she feared she would fall. By morning, the fragile warmth between them had stretched into something tense and quiet. She moved carefully around the house, trying to resume her work as if nothing had happened. But Chris watched her with an intensity that made the back of her neck prickle, concern wrapped in longing, longing wrapped in confusion, confusion wrapped in fear he wasn't ready to name. She felt it even when she tried not to, and because she felt it, she withdrew. She responded politely, professionally, keeping conversations short, stepping away when he stepped closer. She didn't trust the flutter in her chest every time he said her name. She didn't trust the memory of his arms around her in the snow, whispering words she wasn't meant to hear. She didn't trust magic. Magic never stayed. Later that afternoon, Chris's phone rang sharp, insistent, slicing through the quiet. He walked into the foyer to answer, pacing in clipped strides. His voice, usually steady, tightened with irritation. Meredith tried not to listen, but the house carried sound like secrets. She caught fragments. "No, I told you. I'm not leaving yet. I said remote work was fine. Because here matters too." Then suddenly, silence. A different silence. Heavy. Final. When he returned, his face was pale, but not defeated, resolved. "Was everything okay?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. He looked at her, then not at the wreath in her hands, not at the garlands or the snow on her boots, at her. Only her. "Not really," he said softly. "My boss demanded I return to New York immediately." Her heart stuttered. She waited for the inevitable conclusion, the part where he packed and left, and she continued the project alone, pretending the past week hadn't shaken her entire emotional foundation. But instead, he exhaled, as if stepping off a cliff. "I quit." The wreath slipped slightly in her fingers, her breath catching. "Chris," she whispered, stunned. "You quit. You walked away from $1 million career, just to stay here." He shrugged gently, but his eyes held a truth far too loud to ignore. Some things are worth more than money. She didn't know what to say. Her throat tightened, panic rising in her chest. Because if he meant what she thought he meant, then she was in trouble. Deep, emotional trouble. So she did the only thing she knew how to do when life tried to give her something too good. She pushed it away. She kept her answers short the rest of the day, avoided his gaze, pretended not to notice how he looked at her like she was a choice he'd already made. She reminded herself of the difference between them, his world of wealth and privilege, her world of quiet resilience, his whiteness in a country that rewarded it, her blackness in a world that questioned it, his certainty colliding with her lifelong fear of being abandoned the moment she let someone close. Fairy tales weren't written for women like her. She wouldn't be someone's holiday fantasy, only to be forgotten when the snow melted. But Chris didn't forget. He couldn't. And the more she pulled away, the more desperately he needed to understand the truth behind the photograph and the fear gnawing at him. That evening, he drove to the small law office in town where his grandfather's lawyer worked. Snow flurried against the windshield as he parked, heart pounding with questions he didn't yet know how to voice. Artie Stein welcomed him inside, warm and kind as usual. But Chris saw the flicker of knowing in the man's eyes. "You're here about the girl in the photo," Artie said before Chris could speak. Chris swallowed hard. "Yes." Artie leaned back, expression thoughtful. "She looks familiar, doesn't she?" Chris's pulse thudded. Who was she? The lawyer hesitated, choosing his words carefully, as if the truth had sharp edges. "Your grandfather never explained. But he insisted the photo be given to you only this year, and only after his passing." Chris felt a cold dread settle into his bones. "Why me?" Artie's eyes softened with something like pity. "Because," he said quietly, "the girl. She looks very much like Meredith. Doesn't she?" The room seemed to tilt. Chris gripped the edge of the desk, breath shallow. He didn't trust himself to speak. Artie continued gently. "I can't tell you what it means. I don't know if she was a child your grandfather cared for, or something more. Something more." The words rang in Chris's ears like a warning, a daughter, a secret, a legacy hidden for decades. And if Meredith was connected, really connected, what did that make her to him? A distant cousin, a blood relative, a forbidden possibility. His heart slammed painfully because he cared about her. Too much, far too much. And now, the very thought of losing her, losing the possibility of her, pressed against his ribs like a fist. For the first time in his life, fear wrapped itself around his heart. Not the fear of failure or disappointment, but the primal fear of loving someone he might not be allowed to love at all. He left the office, shaken, the snow swirling around him as if the world itself had shifted beneath his feet. The truth was coming for him, and he wasn't sure if it would save him or destroy everything he'd begun to feel. Chris drove back to the lake house with the lawyer's words echoing like ghosts in the cold. "She looks very much like Meredith, doesn't she?" The possibility gnawed at him, twisting every beat of his heart. But before fear could drag him under, his mind returned to her expression that morning, the way she had flinched when he reached out, the way she had wrapped her independence around herself like armor, the way loneliness flickered in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He remembered the brittle humor in her voice when she mentioned her family never celebrating holidays, the quiet resignation, the way she spoke of being an afterthought. That grief resonated with something deep inside him, something older than logic, older than fear. He couldn't let doubt overshadow the woman standing in front of him now. Whatever the truth of the photograph, Meredith was a living soul with an aching heart, and that mattered more than any mystery. So he made a decision right there. Gripping the steering wheel as snow spiraled past the headlights, he would give her something she had been denied all her life. Someone to stand beside her. Someone to choose her. Someone to show her she mattered. Someone to show her she was loved, not by him. Not yet. But by the people whose absence had carved silent wounds in her heart. Her parents. He knew it wouldn't be easy. People like Dr. and Dr. Block lived in numbers and research papers, in logic and practicality. They didn't understand holidays or the magic of snow-dusted nights. They didn't understand childhood wishes hollowed out by loneliness. But Chris understood persistence. He called Baltimore. The first call was ignored. The second, politely deflected. The third, met with confusion. By the fourth, he explained softly, firmly, honestly. Meredith wasn't as untouched as they thought. She wasn't indifferent. She wasn't distant. She wasn't fine. She was hurting, and she needed them, really needed them. More than pride, more than routine, more than whatever reasons they had used for years to convince themselves she didn't. The Blocks resisted at first, too short notice, too busy, too unexpected. But Chris kept speaking, not with authority, but with kindness. And something in the softness of his voice cracked their defenses. After hours of back and forth, of hesitation and guilt resurfacing through the phone line, they agreed. Quietly, almost tremblingly. They would come to Maine for Christmas Eve, not out of obligation, but out of love they had never learned how to express. The next evening, the world outside was wrapped in a frosted hush as Chris drove Meredith to the restaurant under the pretense of a simple holiday dinner. She didn't suspect anything. She never suspected people would do something extraordinary for her. She walked beside him on the wooden dock, snowflakes catching in her curls, cheeks flushed with cold. Her laughter, soft and cautious, filled the space between them, making him forget for a moment the storm of questions inside him. When she pushed open the door to the little seaside restaurant, warmth spilled out to greet them, glowing candles, golden light reflecting off the ocean through frosted windows. And then she froze. Her breath caught in her throat. At a table near the window sat her mother and father, standing as if unsure whether they were allowed to move. Meredith's lips parted soundlessly, her hand flying to her mouth. For a beat, the world seemed to hold its breath with her. Her mother stepped forward first, a woman still in her hospital scrubs, hair pinned back hastily, exhaustion etched in lines beneath her eyes. But her expression was soft, vulnerable, remorseful. Meredith, she whispered, and her voice cracked like thin ice under too much weight. Meredith didn't move. Couldn't. It was as if every childhood Christmas she endured alone pressed in on her at once, wrapped around her chest until she couldn't breathe. Then her mother's arms were around her, pulling her close, tighter than Meredith remembered, tighter than she ever imagined possible. "We thought you didn't want us," her mother murmured. "We thought you preferred being on your own. We thought we were giving you space." Her father stepped in beside them, voice trembling. "But we were wrong. Honey, we were wrong for so long." The dam inside Meredith broke. She crumpled into them, sobbing like a child who had held her tears too many years, her body shaking with the force of it. Her father held her head against his shoulder. Her mother stroked her back, and for the first time in her life, Meredith felt the weight of being loved not ignored, not tolerated, but cherished. Chris stood a few steps behind, silent, letting the moment belong entirely to her. He didn't want gratitude, didn't want attention. He only wanted her to feel the fullness she had been denied. But then she turned, searching. Her gaze moved past her parents, past the candlelight, past the glimmering reflections on the window, until it found him. Her eyes, still wet with tears, softened in a way that pierced straight through the fog of fear he'd carried since visiting the lawyer. She stepped toward him slowly, almost cautiously, as if afraid he might disappear like a miracle overstretched. "You did this," she whispered. He shrugged a little, looking down, not out of arrogance, but humility. "Christmas is for bringing people who love each other back together," he said quietly. "Everyone deserves that." Her breath trembled. Something inside her, something she had locked away for years, melted. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just relief. It was recognition of the man in front of her, of the heart he hid under all that control, of the goodness he tried to downplay. She reached out, fingers brushing his wrist gently, barely a touch, but enough to send warmth sprinting up his arm. "Chris," her voice wavered like the flame of a candle. "No one has ever done anything like this for me." He met her gaze, then slow, deliberate, and something in the space between them tightened, charged, fragile in its newness, yet powerful enough to scare them both. He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. She stood there, her heart finally open, no longer pushing him away, letting herself feel everything she had tried so desperately to suppress. And in that soft, glowing moment, with her parents sitting down behind her and the ocean humming outside, Meredith Block, who never believed in fairy tales, began to believe in him. Christmas Day arrived, wrapped in a soft, shimmering snowfall, the kind that quieted the world and made every footstep feel like it belonged in a fairy tale. The lake house glowed under strands of warm lights, wreaths of evergreen, and ribbons. Meredith had tied herself with hands still trembling from the night before. She had barely slept, spending hours crafting the final touches on the theme she had chosen, Angel Minnie, a tribute to the woman who had taught her love in the shape of recipes, and to the man whose memory still held Chris together. She hung delicate white feathers along the banister, arranged candles in soft halos of light, and placed a small carved angel near the fireplace, its wings subtly etched with the letters M, B, honoring both Minnie Block and Minnie Pascarella, two ghosts whose lives somehow braided the fate of the two people standing in this house now. When the family arrived, the reactions were immediate gasps, laughter, teary eyes. Everyone praised the beauty, the detail, the warmth that poured from every corner. Meredith stepped back, letting them enjoy the magic without stepping into the spotlight. This wasn't her world, this bustling group of joyful relatives. This big Italian-American celebration, with its noise and hugs and easy familial affection. She watched Chris from the edge of the room, surrounded by cousins and aunts and uncles who adored him. A man who belonged effortlessly in a world overflowing with connection. And for the first time since she'd met him, she felt a cold ache bloom in her chest. She didn't belong. Not here. Not in his version of Christmas. Not in a world built on traditions she had only ever witnessed from a distance. Her own holidays spent quietly, pretending she didn't notice the absence of joy. She wrapped her arms around herself as she watched him laugh, the soft glow of firelight catching the edges of his profile. He didn't notice her slipping away, or so she thought. Later that evening, after dinner and stories, and the first round of presents, Chris approached her at the foot of the stairs. In his hand was a plain white envelope, her payment. Her throat tightened. She had been expecting this moment, yet she still wasn't ready for the sting. She reached for it, with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for treating me kindly," she said softly, fighting the quiver in her voice. "You've been a wonderful client." Client. The word tasted like ash. It was a shield she didn't want, but felt she needed. Before she could step away, Chris caught her wrist gently, but firmly enough that she stopped breathing for a second. "Meredith," he said, voice low and rough with something she couldn't decipher. "I need to tell you something." She tried to pull her hand back, but he held on, guiding her toward a quieter corner of the living room, where the chatter faded into the background. The warmth of his touch traveled up her arm. Too familiar, too precious, too dangerous. When they stopped, he looked at her with eyes stripped of all defenses. "It's about my grandfather," he began, "and about you." A chill skittered down her spine. "What are you talking about?" Chris swallowed hard, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a worn photograph, edges creased, colors faded, history heavy in the paper. He handed it to her. "This was in the letter my grandfather left for me. A second will, sealed for 30 years. Meredith stared at the image, an old man, younger than she'd ever seen him in the pictures at the house, holding the hand of a little black girl with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. A girl who looked uncannily, impossibly familiar. Her breath faltered. "Chris, what is this?" He looked tortured. "I don't know. But I showed it to someone, and he said, 'She looks like you. Too much like you.'" Meredith's heart plummeted, fear and confusion warring inside her. "What are you implying?" Stepped closer, shaking his head as if fighting unseen demons. "I don't know what she was to him. A child he helped. A child he loved. A secret he kept. But I was terrified when I realized what that resemblance might mean. Terrified that maybe you're family. That maybe I shouldn't feel what I feel for you." She stiffened as if struck. The idea twisted something deep inside her, not disgust, not exactly fear, but the crushing weight of losing something before it even began. Tears pricked her eyes, unbidden. But then Chris lifted her chin gently, forcing her to meet his gaze. His voice broke open, raw and trembling. "But here's the truth," he whispered. "Even if you are connected to me in some distant, complicated way, even if you're part of my grandfather's past, my heart already chose you." Her breath hitched. He stepped closer, hands warm against her arms. "I fell for you before I knew anything about this picture, before I knew anything about secrets or possibilities or bloodlines. I love you, Meredith. I love you in a way I can't walk back from." Her tears spilled over, the confession soft, trembling. Terrified, shattered the last of her defenses. "Chris," she choked, voice breaking. "I love you too. I do. But I'm so scared. Her walls, built from years of abandonment and disappointment, crumbled at his feet. I don't belong in your world. I don't fit your story. And if that picture changes everything. He cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheek. Nothing changes how I feel. His voice steadied, full of conviction. You and I, we get to choose what family means. We get to choose who we love. And I choose you. She trembled under the weight of it, under the truth of being chosen, wanted, cherished in a way she'd never imagined. You're not alone anymore, he murmured. You don't ever have to be. A soft sob escaped her as she pressed her forehead to his chest, her fingers gripping his sweater. She felt his arms wrap around her, strong and certain, anchoring her in a way that felt like home. The world outside the window glowed with Christmas lights, and inside that room, for the first time in both their lives, the future didn't feel frightening. It felt possible. It felt theirs. A week after Christmas, when the snow on the lake settled into a soft, unbroken sheet, and the world seemed to breathe slower, gentler. The call finally came. Chris had been pacing the living room for nearly an hour, unable to focus on the stack of documents on the coffee table or the half-drunk mug of tea cooling beside it. Meredith, curled on the couch with a blanket over her legs, looked up every few minutes, sensing the tension simmering beneath his calm exterior. When his phone rang, her heart skipped. He answered with a tentative breath. The lawyer spoke for several minutes, details, records, names, timelines, and then delivered the truth that washed through the room like a warm wind dissolving snow. The little girl in the photograph was not Meredith. She was the daughter of a close friend of Chris's grandfather, a child he had promised to look after during a difficult chapter in her family's life. There was no shared bloodline, no hidden lineage, no forbidden tie. Just an act of kindness sealed into memory and tucked away for a grandson to discover decades later. Chris closed his eyes, releasing a breath he felt he'd been holding since the night he first saw Meredith on the porch, glowing in the snowlight, as if fate had carved her silhouette from every dream he'd never dared to articulate. Relief washed over him undeniably, but beneath it was a deeper understanding that steadied him more than the news itself. Even if the truth had revealed something complicated, even if the past had tied them together in a way that made the path forward difficult. His heart had already made its choice, long before reason stepped into the room. Meredith watched him quietly as he sat beside her, the tension draining from his shoulders. She saw the shift in his posture, the softened line of his jaw, the small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's not me," she whispered. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. "No," he replied softly. "It never was." She leaned into the couch cushions, emotions flickering across her face, relief, disbelief, gratitude, and something tender that made her chest feel too full. She hadn't realized how much the uncertainty had weighed on her until it lifted. Chris reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers with a gentleness that felt like a vow. "But I need you to know something," he said, voice low and earnest. "Nothing about the results changes how I feel. I didn't love you because of a mystery, and I wouldn't have stopped because of one either." Meredith's throat tightened. That kind of devotion, the kind that chose her regardless of circumstance, was a gift she'd never been taught to expect. A gift she still wasn't sure she deserved. though she was learning, slowly, that love didn't wait for worthiness. It simply stayed. The weeks that followed became a new rhythm. Meredith split her time between South Bristol and Christmas Cove, her car carving a familiar path through snow-covered towns as she began opening a second event planning branch. She dove into the work with a spark she hadn't felt in years, designing winter galas, building community events, decorating old inns with garlands and soft lights. Christmas Cove embraced her with an ease that startled her at first. They remembered her name, her smile, her touch. They asked for her ideas, trusted her instincts, welcomed her into conversations as though she'd lived there all her life. And beside her, steadfast, patient, resolute, was Chris. No longer a businessman straining under the weight of a life that didn't fit him. He poured himself into something new, a foundation for children without holiday traditions, born from the photograph that once haunted him and now guided him. He spent days meeting families, funding programs, partnering with schools and shelters. He insisted it wasn't charity. It was honoring the man who raised him, the man who had cared for a stranger's child and taught Chris that generosity was just another word for love. Every evening, no matter how far either of them had traveled that day, they returned to the lake house. It became their ritual, their sanctuary, their place of becoming. They cooked together, argued playfully about recipes, teased each other about decorating styles, her love of gentle details, his obsession with symmetry, and then bundled up in coats to step outside into the crisp night air. The sky above Christmas Cove always seemed to hang lower in winter, the stars bright and close. In that quiet, they strung lights around the porch, checked the bulbs, replaced those that flickered, shaping a nightly ceremony that became less about the decorations and more about the act of doing something together, something small, shared, intimate. Each evening, the house glowed a little warmer, a little brighter, as if the love inside its walls fed the lights themselves. On one such night, as a gentle snowfall began drifting across the lake, Chris wrapped his arms around Meredith from behind, pulling her against his chest. She melted into him without hesitation, her breath misting the cold air. He rested his chin lightly on her shoulder, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "I don't know if I believe in destiny," he murmured, "but I believe in the moment you walked through my doorway with that hot cup of coffee." Meredith laughed, a quiet, bubbling sound that warmed the cold air around them. She tilted her head back, just enough to see his face. "Then I guess," she whispered, brushing her nose against his cheek, "I'll have to keep bringing coffee into your life. Every Christmas morning." He smiled slow, steady, certain as though she had promised him the world. And maybe she had. Because what grew between them wasn't a whirlwind fantasy or a fragile spark destined to burn out with the season. It was something steadier, something earned, a love built on shared fears and chosen courage, on secrets unburied and truths embraced, on finding family, not in blood, but in the hearts that refused to let go. A love that started with winter, but didn't end with it. For the first time in their lives, Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was a beginning, a promise, a home, a light that would never fade. And as the house glowed behind them, wrapped in a halo of warm bulbs shimmering through the snowfall, Meredith understood that this feeling, This man, this future was her Christmas that would never end. A full year had passed since that first Christmas, the Christmas that unraveled their guarded hearts, rewrote their futures, and stitched two lonely stories into a single thread. Winter returned to Christmas Cove with its usual quiet authority, laying a soft white blanket across rooftops and stilling the world beneath a hush that made even time seem to breathe slower. Meredith Block stood in front of her newest storefront window. Merry Events, Christmas Cove, admiring the gold lettering she had painted herself. The pride blooming in her chest was calm, steady, earned through long nights and early mornings, and a determination carved from every year she'd spent believing she wasn't enough. Now, she was not only enough, she had become a force in this small town. Clients lined up months in advance. Locals greeted her with a warmth she once thought belonged only to others. She was the only black woman in the region, running a major events firm, and instead of being doubted, she was respected, embraced, celebrated. Chris often teased her for being the busiest person he knew, but he said it with a smile full of affection, the kind that made her heart glow with a quiet gratitude she carried everywhere. As for him, the transformation was just as profound. After leaving the relentless world of Manhattan corporate life, Chris had poured himself into the community of Christmas Cove with an unexpected tenderness. He wasn't the man who once measured days by profits and negotiations. Now he managed local investments, mentored young entrepreneurs, and chaired the holiday charity fund that became his passion project. The townspeople adored him, though they never adored him as fiercely as Meredith did. Their love had changed too. The fiery spark of that first winter had deepened into something slow-burning and steady, like embers that never went out. They moved with the ease of two people who knew each other, not just intimately, but truthfully flaws, fears, childhood scars, secret dreams, all of it. They still teased, still argued, still stole quiet kisses in aisles of hardware stores and grocery markets. But beneath the laughter, there was something else now, a certainty neither had ever dared to hope for. On a foggy morning in late December, Chris appeared at her door with gloved hands tucked awkwardly into his pockets, the kind of subtle nervousness Meredith almost never saw in him. "Walk with me," he asked. She raised an eyebrow, amused. "In this fog, you planning to kidnap me?" He grinned, only a little. She laughed, grabbing her scarf. They walked toward the lake, boots crunching softly over fresh powder. The fog clung to the air like a veil, thick and silver, making the world feel smaller, more intimate. When they stepped onto the frozen lake, Meredith hesitated, poking the ice with her toe. "You sure this thing won't crack under your giant size 10 shoes today?" he said, offering his hand. "The ice can handle anything. Trust me." She slid her fingers into his, warmth flaring instantly up her arm, though the air was frigid enough to sting her cheeks. They walked farther than she ever comfortably went. Something felt unusual about him today, a quiet focus beneath his casual demeanor. She squeezed his hand lightly. "You're acting weird," she teased. "Weird how, like you're about to confess to a crime." He chuckled. But there was a shimmer behind his eyes that made her stomach flutter. And then, it happened. The fog thinned just enough for a soft glow to emerge beneath their feet. Meredith frowned, looking down. At first it seemed like her eyes were playing tricks on her. But then the glow sharpened. A circle of light. Then two. Then a trail. And suddenly across the entire surface of the frozen lake, hundreds of tiny LED lights flickered on beneath the ice, arranged with meticulous planning, patience, and breathtaking intention. They spelled out 4 words that stole the breath from her lungs. Marry me, Meredith. Her hands flew to her mouth. Chris was all she managed. The cold around her melted into an overwhelming warmth that flushed her entire body. She turned to him, but he was already lowering himself onto one knee. On the ice, in the fog, in the very place that had become the quiet heart of their story. The faint shimmer of the lake lights danced against his dark coat, catching on the sapphire ring resting in his palm. The stone gleamed the exact shade of his eyes, and his eyes were full of her, completely, unapologetically, eternally. He took a breath, steady but emotional, and spoke in a voice meant only for her. You lit up that Christmas, our Christmas. You lit up a life I didn't even realize had gone dark. His words wavered, but his gaze never did. You walked into my house with a cup of coffee, and something in me just woke up. You didn't just brighten the place, you brightened me. You brightened everything. Meredith felt tears spill over, freezing on her cheeks almost instantly in the cold air. Chris continued, voice deepening into something raw, reverent. I don't want a life without you, Mer. I don't want holidays without your laugh. I don't want mornings without your voice. I don't want years without your hand in mine. He lifted the ring toward her, his knee firmly in the cold ice, utterly unbothered. Meredith Block, will you marry me? Will you let me make Christmas with you, not once a year, but forever? Her breath broke. Her heart broke open. For a moment she couldn't speak. Overwhelmed by a truth she hadn't dared name, this was the first time in her whole life she felt truly chosen, not tolerated, not included out of pity or convenience. Chosen, wanted, loved, and not quietly, not halfway, but boldly under the whole winter sky. Yes, she whispered, voice cracking, then stronger. Yes, Chris. Yes. He stood, slipping the ring onto her hand with shaking fingers. She didn't wait for him to straighten completely before she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his neck as he held her tight, their breaths forming clouds of joy in the cold air. Then a sudden eruption of sound burst from the lake's edge cheers. Applause, whoops of celebration. Meredith jerked back, startled, wiping tears with trembling hands. Through the fog, silhouettes emerged. Dozens of them. Chris's cousins, her parents, his mother, the shopkeepers, the mayor, the kids from the community center Chris funded, practically the entire town, all bundled in scarves and coats, watching with beaming smiles. You, Meredith stammered, laughing through tears. You planned all this. They insisted. Chris admitted sheepishly, and apparently they're terrible at keeping secrets, so it's a miracle you didn't find out. Her parents came rushing across the frozen surface, slipping awkwardly but determined. Her mother hugged her, Her father lifted her off her feet. Chris's family swarmed them next. Laughter echoed into the fog. Snowflakes drifted down, catching in her curls. And for a long moment, Meredith stood in the center of that glowing lake ring on her finger, Chris's arms around her waist, the whole town cheering, and felt what she had never known before, belonging. Not as someone who had to earn it, not as someone who had to shrink or apologize. As herself, under the falling snow. Chris touched her cheek gently, his voice just for her. "Our beginning," he said softly, "our forever beginning." And she leaned into him, smiling through the last of her tears, knowing he was right. It was only the beginning. Summer settled gently over Christmas Cove, softening the edges of the lake house until it looked like a watercolor painting come to life. Lavender bloomed in thick purple waves along the garden path, brushing the air with a sweet, calming perfume that drifted all the way to the dock. It was here, in the garden behind the house where everything had begun, that Meredith Block prepared to walk toward the future she once never believed she could have. Her white dress hugged her in all the right places, simple, elegant, shaped to her body like it had been waiting years to belong to her. Sunlight kissed her skin, making her rich brown complexion glow with a softness that stole the breath of everyone gathered. But for Chris, waiting under the arch of woven birch branches and lavender stems, she was more than beautiful. She was the center of his world. He stood tall in a cream suit, hands clasped loosely in front of him. But his eyes, those unguarded blue eyes, betrayed the emotions he tried to keep steady: awe, gratitude, and the kind of love that rewires a man from the inside out. When the music began and Meredith stepped forward, Chris's breath caught, despite trying to inhale. She walked toward him as if the earth knew to move out of her way. The small crowd of family and friends blurred around the edges as her gaze met his, steady, trusting, luminous. She had fought years of loneliness to stand here. He had fought years of expectations to deserve her. Together, they were rewriting every story they'd been told about who they were meant to be. The ceremony unfolded beneath the summer sun, warm but forgiving. A gentler heat than July usually offered, as if the weather itself knew to be tender today. The priest's voice carried softly over the lavender. "Christian Ackerman, do you vow to cherish and honor Meredith Block today and every day forward?" Chris lifted her hands into his. "Forever." His voice cracked at the edges, but he didn't look away from her. Not even for a heartbeat. "Meredith," blinking back a sheen of tears, whispered her vow, "You are the family I didn't dare dream I could have." And at that, something in Chris's chest gave way. He squeezed her fingers, grounding her, grounding himself. When they kissed, the guests erupted into applause. But to them, the world had gone silent, shrinking down to the heat of that moment, the promise sealed in their breath. The reception stretched well into the night, golden lights overhead swaying gently in the summer breeze, like tiny blessings suspended in the air. Music echoed across the lake. Glasses clinked. People danced barefoot on the grass. Laughter weaving through the dark like a second melody. Meredith and Chris moved through it all like two halves of a whole, her fingers brushing his shoulder, his hand warming the small of her back. The two of them looking at each other as though continually remembering the miracle of finally being seen. The lake lapped against the shoreline in quiet applause, and the moon rose high, silvering the edges of the water as if offering its own benediction. Chris caught Meredith at one point, alone beneath the lights, her head tipped back in laughter. He walked to her, cupped her jaw, and kissed her like no one else existed. She kissed him back, like she had been waiting her entire life for this happiness. 3 months later. Autumn had barely begun to paint the trees when Meredith noticed something was off. At first, it was small, strange cravings for honey at midnight, exhaustion that pulled at her limbs like heavy silk, emotional waves that hit without warning. Chris noticed before she did. Every morning she crawled into his arms, complaining that her feelings were doing weird, ridiculous things, and he would stroke her hair, trying to mend fears she didn't yet understand. But when she fainted briefly in the kitchen one morning, he bundled her into the car faster than she could protest. They sat in the exam room, fingers intertwined, anxiety drumming through his thumb as it brushed the back of her hand. The doctor smiled with that knowing expression only doctors and grandmothers possess. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "There are 2 heartbeats." Meredith blinked. 2. What? The doctor chuckled. "Twins. Both healthy. Both strong." For a moment, Meredith's mind emptied completely. She stared at Chris, speechless. Breath caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. Chris froze too, but only for a second. Then joy erupted out of him, like a boy hearing the world's greatest secret. He laughed loud, bright, unrestrained, and pulled her into his arms so tightly she felt his heartbeat hammer against hers. Tears spilled down his cheeks before he could wipe them away. "You've given me so much, Meredith," he whispered into her hair. "More than I ever knew how to ask for." She cupped his face, her own tears soft and overwhelmed. "Christmas next year. There will be 2 babies crying in this house. If they cry, I'll rock them myself. If the whole town needs decorating, I'll decorate every roof. If the twins need a father who rearranges the universe for them, I'll be that man." He kissed her forehead. Reverent. "Twins, Meredith. Can you believe it? We're going to have a real family." Outside the hospital window, snow began to fall even though it was too early for winter. A quiet, drifting snowfall, like a blessing arriving ahead of schedule. In Christmas Cove, the first flakes always signaled magic returning fate, whispering across rooftops. Possibility settling on the earth. Meredith leaned into Chris, hand resting over the small growing life inside her, and felt a warmth she had never known. A home she never dared dream she'd earn, a future she could finally trust. And as snowflakes clung to the window like tiny stars, she whispered silently in her heart, "This is where I belong." Christmas arrived early that year, settling over Christmas Cove with a softness that made the whole town look like it had been dipped in frosting. Snow clung to rooftops, traced the outlines of the pine trees, and wrapped the lake house in a quiet, luminous glow, as if the universe understood what a sacred season this would be for the family inside. Meredith and Chris were living through the most chaotic, sleepless, messy, miraculous days of their lives. Their twins, little Eli and Maya, had just turned 3 months old, and their world had rearranged itself around midnight feedings. Tiny socks that mysteriously disappeared in the laundry, and the kind of exhaustion that made them laugh at nothing and everything at once. Yet somehow, beneath the whirlwind, There was a tenderness that grew like a hidden ember, warming every inch of the home they had built. Eli had Chris's ocean blue eyes, framed by long lashes that made him look perpetually curious about the world, and a small, earnest mouth that reminded Chris achingly of his grandfather Pasquarella. Maya, meanwhile, carried Meredith's honey-brown skin and warm chocolate eyes, already watching everything with a quiet intensity that made Mir smile, because she recognized that same fire in herself. Every time Chris held them both, one in each arm, he felt a tightness in his chest, the kind that only came when a man realized he was witnessing the greatest blessing he had ever been trusted with. One snowy morning, Meredith cradled Eli against her chest, rocking him gently as he blinked sleepily. Her voice dropped to a whisper meant just for him. "Do you know," she murmured, brushing her thumb along his cheek, "that this will be the first Christmas I won't spend alone?" Chris stepped behind her then, sliding his arms around her waist, resting his chin atop her head, pressing a soft kiss into her curls. "And the first Christmas, I feel like I truly have a family," he answered, voice low and warm. Meredith leaned back into him, letting the moment settle like falling snow. Later that day, as family members began arriving one by one, the house transformed into a tapestry of overlapping voices, warm coats, and excited greetings. Chris's mother was the first to reach for baby Maya, tears welling in her eyes the moment the tiny girl curled her fist around her finger. "Her skin is so soft," she whispered, choking up as she turned to her son. "I never expected you, my work-obsessed, tunnel-visioned boy, to turn into a father this devoted." Chris laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mom, the first 2 months I didn't know what I was doing. Meredith carried all of us." Meredith shook her head but smiled, her heart swelling at the pride in his voice. When her own parents arrived unexpectedly, no longer distant, no longer unsure, her mother approached her quietly, carrying a bouquet of winter roses. She looked at Meredith with eyes shining full of pride, as though seeing her daughter for the first time in years. "You make me remember," she said, touching Meredith's cheek. "Why Christmas is worth pausing life for, why love matters." And Meredith, blinking through sudden tears, whispered, "I learned that from Chris." That evening, after dinner and soft carols hummed over the living room, Chris gathered everyone and guided them outside. The cold night wrapped around them instantly, crisp and bright, while the moon cast a silver glow over the lake, frozen into a perfect mirror. Meredith gasped the moment she saw it, thousands of tiny lights strung across the backyard, forming 2 enormous wings, one set glowing warm gold, the other shimmering pale silver, arching outward like guardian angels, cradling the frozen lake. The lights spilled their reflection across the ice, making it appear as though the wings stretched endlessly into the water. "It's breathtaking," Meredith whispered, her voice trembling as Maya slept against her shoulder. Chris slipped his arm around her, drawing her closer. "2 angels," he said, glancing at Eli and Maya, for the 2 miracles that changed everything. Family and friends fell silent, their breath rising in small clouds, eyes glistening as they absorbed the spectacle. It wasn't just decoration, it was devotion, a promise illuminated against the winter sky. Meredith looked at the scene, overwhelmed by how far she had come. "Last year," she said softly, I didn't think I belonged anywhere." Her voice was steady, but Chris heard the truth beneath it, the old wounds, the old loneliness. He turned to her fully, brushing a snowflake from her eyebrow, and now he asked gently, searching her face. She looked down at Maya, sleeping peacefully against her, then at Eli resting in Chris's arms, and finally at the glowing house behind them, their house alive with warmth, laughter, family. Then she looked up at Chris, the man who had changed her life with nothing more than honesty, stubborn devotion, and an unshakable tenderness she had once thought impossible. "Now," she said, tears sliding down her cheeks, "I have the whole world." He exhaled shakily, pulling her, Eli, and Maya close until all four of them were held in the same embrace. Snow drifted around them like a blessing, soft and slow. "I promise," Chris whispered, lips against her temple. "Every Christmas from now on will be more magical than the one before. I don't know what the future will throw at us, but I know you and these two are the truest choice I've ever made." A small sound broke the silence, then Maya stirring. Eli blinking awake, and suddenly both babies cooed at the same time, voices soft and sweet, as if offering their own tiny approval. The entire family laughed, the sound rising warmly into the cold air. And in that moment, surrounded by light and love and the unexpected harmony of their children's first Christmas noises, Meredith felt something settle in her heart, a peace she had never known, a certainty she had never trusted. Christmas Cove had never felt warmer, and so began the first of many winters, filled with falling snow, glowing lights, soft baby giggles, and a love that grew deeper, braver, and more intricate with every passing season, because this was only the beginning of the life they were building together, one Christmas at a time.